Let's dive into Mustafa İslamoğlu's lectures. We're exploring the deep, unbreakable bond between intellect and faith.
So remove intellect from a believing mind. What are you actually left with? Let's find out.
Islamoğlu calls this invented religion. It's a corrupted system built purely on superstition and blind obedience.
See, true revealed religion champions morality and justice. Invented religion just relies on meaningless dogma to control you.
Here's the kicker. True faith actually demands aql, active, critical reasoning. It's never just passive submission.
Applying that intellect means we've got to decode the Quran's profound symbolic language, not just read it blindly. Take Moses and the wise man's journey. Damaged ships, tragic deaths, it all seems completely paradoxical, right? But honestly, can we take stories involving the death of a child as literal commands? No way!
Islamoğlu's warning is super clear here. Taking metaphors literally turns sacred texts into justifications for real-world violence.
History proves this. Extremist groups like the Kharijites literally use this exact reading to justify murdering innocents.
When a metaphor becomes a literal truth in the hands of the ignorant, it inevitably breeds violence.
This huge historical danger brings us to a crossroads, two completely opposite understandings of religion itself.
The core takeaway? The absolute, non-negotiable foundation of true religion isn't dogma. It is morality.
Surah al-Balad proves this. Free the slave, feed the hungry. Ethical action is a strict prerequisite to belief.
The message is incredibly powerful. You must first be a good human before you can be a believer. Invented religion completely reverses this. It prioritizes empty rituals as a magic eraser for deeply immoral actions. Build faith on lies and you aren't left with religion, just a fragile house of superstitions.
Philosopher Muhammad Iqbal echoed this exact divide. He contrasted pure Quranic faith directly against dogmatic clericalism.
True faith cannot be selfish. As Ali Shariati believed, it has to serve the liberation of all humanity.
So I'll leave you with this. Is your faith built on intellect and morality, or just inherited dogma?
How does a society that's just absolutely filled with religious rituals, where prayers are constant and traditions are deeply embedded in everyday life, still suffer from profound, almost inescapable moral crises? It's a fascinating paradox, right? I mean, you'd logically think that more religion automatically equals more morality, but history and, honestly, sociology often show us the exact opposite. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unravel this exact mystery.
Today, we are unpacking a really dense, highly provocative, and frankly fascinating theological and sociological thesis presented by the scholar Mustafa İslamoğlu in his extensive lecture series. We're going to objectively analyze his core argument, which focuses on a massive historical paradigm shift that he claims fractured the very foundation of faith. Our goal here isn't to take sides, but to clearly understand the source material and connect the dots on exactly how these concepts evolved.
All right, so here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. The core problem. 2. Two types of religion. 3. The danger of literalism. 4. Morality before dogma. And finally, reclaiming critical thinking. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The core problem.
To really grasp the proposed solution here, we first need to clearly see the societal decay that the source material is critiquing. According to Islamoğlu, the core problem is that ritualistic practices frequently mask severe ethical failures. For example, he points out the stark hypocrisy of a boss who exploits his workers' labor, yet genuinely believes his daily prayers are just instantly erasing that exploitation. We also see the justification of extreme violence all wrapped up in religious rhetoric, the tragic death of critical thought, and a society that ends up treating faith as a mere transaction. It's like treating religion as a vending machine ticket to paradise rather than actually living a moral life.
Moving on to Section 2. Two types of religion.
So how exactly did a faith system lose its moral compass?
Well, the source contrasts two radically different frameworks to explain this. On one side, we have what's called revealed religion, or Indirilen. This framework is anchored in reason, justice, and what the source calls ubudiyet, which is basically a continuous moral lifestyle of devotion that permeates literally every action you take. But then, on the flip side, we have what the speaker calls fabricated religion, or Uydurulan. This is a system based on dogma, the exploitation of the masses, blind obedience, and ibadet, which in this specific context refers to isolated, empty rituals that have been completely divorced from actual moral behavior. The big argument here is that the fabricated religion historically hijacked the revealed one.
Section 3. The danger of literalism.
Now you're probably wondering, exactly how did this dangerous shift toward fabricated dogma happen? The source points to a really fascinating, though tragic, linguistic misunderstanding. The lecture argues that sacred texts heavily utilize symbolic language, or symbolic deal. This language is deliberately designed to convey deep underlying wisdom, called hakikat, or truth. It is absolutely not meant to be read as gerçeklik, which means literal, historical reality. The source strongly warns that taking beautiful, profound metaphors and reading them as literal historical instructions basically takes the light of faith and turns it into a highly destructive fire. Let's look at a concrete example from the source material to see how this plays out. The lecture does a deep dive into the famous Quranic parable in Surah Kehf involving Moses and a wise servant, a figure often mythologized as Khidr. So in this story, the wise servant damages a ship and even takes a life, which are actions that completely baffle Moses. The source argues emphatically that this is a purely symbolic narrative. It's meant to teach about paradoxes and the unseen mercy that protects the vulnerable. But if you read this literally as a historical reality, you end up with a divine justification for actual murder and property damage. And unfortunately, as the source points out, that is exactly what happened. The historical timeline of this literalism is, frankly, incredibly grim. The source traces how, starting around the 7th century, literal readings began stripping these parables of their metaphorical truth entirely. By the early Islamic era, extremist factions known as the Kharijites were using these literal interpretations of the wise servant story to justify horrific violence against literally anyone who disagreed with them. Fast forward to the Ottoman era, and the lecture highlights how literalist religious frameworks were actually exploited by sultans to legalize fratricide. They point to a chilling historical event where a ruler legally murdered 19 of his own brothers in a single night, completely justified under this fabricated framework. The source uses these examples to show the terrifying real-world consequences of turning metaphor into literal law. Section 4. Morality before dogma. Having established this deep historical problem, the explainer pivots to a proposed solution. How do we reverse this decay? The source material outlines a structural path back to true faith, using Surah al-Balad as the guide. And you've really got to pay attention to this sequence. Step 1 is liberation, free a slave. Step 2 is charity, feed the hungry. Step 3 is compassion, care for the orphan or the fallen. Notice what comes last? Only at step 4 do we arrive at become a believer. The lecture insists on this as an absolute prerequisite. You have to be a moral, compassionate, functioning human being before you can even adopt the label of a believer. Think of faith as the roof, but morality is the foundation. But what's truly staggering is the sheer scale of the obstacle preventing people from finding that simple moral path. To put it into perspective, the speaker claims that the fabricated religion relies on a massive 1.5 million invented sayings, rumors, and historical fabrications. 1.5 million. This giant wall of text was built, according to the source, to intentionally bury that foundational moral core and replace it with confusing, easily manipulated rules. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Reclaiming Critical Thinking. So, how in the world do we break through 1.5 million layers of fabricated dogma? The source demands a radical reclamation of our intellect. Just like a muscle only grows when you subject it to resistance, the lecturer argues that the absolutely only way to increase the mind's capacity is to actively challenge it. We can't just accept easy answers, we can't outsource our morality to historical dogma, we literally have to wrestle with the truth. To really drive this point home, the source material calls upon 3 high-impact historical thinkers who noticed this exact same societal decay. First up is the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal. He sharply contrasted what he called the religion of the mullah, which he argued merely creates societal mischief and division, against the genuine, illuminating light of the original source texts. Next we have the sociologist Ali Shariati. He observed that the dominant religious practices in the East, pretty much ever since the Mongol invasions, had devolved into a rigid, unquestioning orthodoxy. He controversially compared it to the Dark Ages of Catholicism, stating that this paralyzed, fabricated structure fundamentally ruined the region's intellectual progress. And finally, the thinker Nurettin Topçu. He delivered perhaps the most hard-hitting assessment of them all, perfectly echoing that sequence of morality we looked at earlier. He stated that the current fabricated practices have ruined the region, and that people must first abandon this empty ritualism and enter the era of humanity. In short,
You have to become a human being with a functioning conscience before you go around claiming to be religious.
Which brings us to the ultimate question this entire source material forces us to ask ourselves. We've seen the symptoms of moral decay, we've unpacked the crucial difference between revealed truth and fabricated dogma, and we've looked at the terrifying historical dangers of turning metaphors into literal weapons. So, the choice presented is clear. Will you blindly inherit a fabricated tradition just because it was handed to you? Or will you dare to reclaim your critical intellect, demand morality before dogma, and challenge your own mind to actually seek the truth? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, keep challenging your capacity, and I will catch you next time.
So, what if the spiritual rituals that millions of people practice today,
Right.
things like, just rolling prayer beads between their fingers or waiting for one specific magical holy night to wipe away an entire year's worth of sins, what if they weren't just harmless traditions?
Yeah. What if they were actually historically imported tools? Like tools designed to deliberately destroy the ethical core of a religion.
Exactly. I mean, it forces a complete reevaluation of how we understand belief.
It really does. You're taking these physical actions that people perform every single day, often totally on autopilot, right?
Oh, absolutely on autopilot.
And you're questioning their ultimate origin, their psychological function, and I think most importantly, who actually benefits from that autopilot.
Right. Well, welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are diving deep into a really fascinating stack of lecture transcripts today.
Yeah, and we're unpacking a central, recurring, and honestly, highly provocative argument.
Definitely provocative. The core of this exploration is this profound tension between two completely contrasting concepts found in the sources.
Right, the first being what the original speaker calls revealed religion.
Which is defined in these lectures as this dynamic system rooted in ethics, intellect, and just intense personal responsibility.
Yeah, and then you have the second concept, which is what the speaker terms invented religion.
And this invented religion is described as a system that's systematically built on, well, hollow ritual.
Hollow rituals, fatalism, and the justification of absolute power.
Exactly. It's a massive structural critique of how ideas sort of morph over centuries.
Yeah. I mean, we're looking at a historical and sociological landscape where a philosophy that, supposedly started as this pristine, flowing river gets dammed up, diverted, and just turned into stagnant pools.
Stagnant pools. That's a great way to put it. And I think it's really worth pausing here to recognize just how provocative these lectures actually are.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the speaker isn't just making an abstract theological point here. They are actively indicting some of the most revered empires in history.
Specific historical figures, deeply entrenched doctrines.
Yeah, it is a highly controversial stance. So our goal today is just to map out these arguments and act as your guides through this really fascinating intellectual terrain.
Right. We are impartially reporting on these viewpoints.
Exactly. We want to convey the original speaker's thesis to you without endorsing or, taking sides on any of the politically or historically charged content.
We're just here to understand the mechanics of the argument itself.
Right. And the mechanics of that argument, they actually start with the most basic tactile element of religious practice.
The physical objects people hold in their hands.
Yes. Let's jump right into that because the transcripts zero in on the concept of Tasbih.
Right.
Usually, if you look this up, it translates to the glorification of God. But the foundational claim in the sources here is that the original root meaning of this word was something entirely different.
It wasn't passive at all.
No, it was hyperactive.
Yeah, the etymology explored in the sources suggests that Tasbih originally meant acting in accordance with the laws of creation.
Right.
It was this intense intellectual and physical command. I mean, in the early centuries, the interpretation of this concept drove an absolute explosion of scientific inquiry.
Like literal science.
Literally.
Yeah.
It meant studying physics, biology, mathematics, and astronomy to understand the cosmos.
Wow.
And then, aligning human civilization with those universal laws. It was about discovering how the universe works.
And honoring the creator by utilizing that hard-won knowledge, right? To build hospitals, map the stars, better humanity.
Exactly. It was an active pursuit of science and ethics.
But, and here's the crazy part, fast forward to today, and if you say Tasbih, the immediate image is a string of beads.
Right. A physical object.
The act of sitting in a quiet corner, passively clicking beads on a string, just repeating a specific phrase. So how do we get from, study astrophysics and biology to roll a little wooden bead with your thumb? Like, what is the mechanism of that transformation?
Well, the historical archaeology done in these lectures traces this shift through these periods of massive empire building and cultural assimilation. The sources argue that physical prayer beads have absolutely no origin in early Islam.
Wait, really? None at all?
None. Instead, the usage is traced directly back to Hindu and Buddhist origins.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they were absorbed into the culture much later, likely during the cosmopolitan expansion of cities like Baghdad.
Which was this massive hub of international trade and cultural exchange.
Exactly. It's the cultural osmosis of a globalized trade hub.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and the texts point out that the Hindu god Shiva is traditionally associated with a rosary of 33 beads.
Right.
And Buddhism heavily utilizes a rosary of 108 beads. So these physical objects were imported, they became fashionable or culturally normalized, and over time,
that active, demanding intellectual concept of Tasbih was entirely hollowed out.
Completely hollowed out. It was just replaced by this passive physical repetition.
Okay, so if I'm trying to map this onto everyday psychology.
Sure.
Let's say I read a life-changing, fundamentally brilliant book on financial literacy, right?
Okay.
It tells me to budget my money, cut my excessive expenses, analyze the market, invest wisely. It demands action.
Lots of action.
But instead of actually doing any of that hard work, I just sit in a very comfortable armchair and I count the pages of the book over and over.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Like I'm just flipping them rhythmically, hoping that the act of counting the pages will magically make me rich.
Yeah.
Is that essentially what the source is arguing happened to the concept of Tasbih?
That analogy hits the psychological nail right on the head.
Wow.
Because reducing a profound, demanding ethical and intellectual command down to a repetitive physical ritual, it serves a very specific psychological purpose.
Which is what?
It provides the dopamine hit of accomplishment without the friction of actual effort.
Oh, wow.
It allows a person to feel incredibly righteous, to feel like they have, completed their religious duty without actually undergoing the transformative, difficult work of ethical living.
Or intellectual inquiry.
Right. You count the pages, you feel like a financial genius, but your bank account is empty and you're still in debt.
That's chilling, honestly. You roll the beads, you feel deeply pious, but your society remains stagnant, uneducated, and unjust.
Exactly. And this hollowing out of the core doesn't stop at physical objects either.
No, it doesn't.
The transcripts apply this exact same critique to the concept of time itself.
Right, specifically focusing on the Night of Decree, or Qadr Gecesi in Turkish.
Yeah.
This is universally recognized as the holiest night of the year in the Islamic calendar, traditionally marking the night the Quran was first revealed. But the lectures launch this just devastating critique of the modern psychology surrounding it.
They do. The modern observance is characterized here as the ultimate spiritual lottery ticket.
A spiritual lottery ticket.
Yeah. The framework we are analyzing argues that this night has been culturally transformed into a giant cosmic washing machine.
A washing machine. I love that phrasing from the text.
Right, because the underlying psychology allows an individual to live completely unethically. I mean, they can exploit their workers, lie in their business dealings,
cheat their neighbors,
actively ignore justice for 364 days out of the year.
But
as long as they stay awake and perform a specific set of mechanical rituals on this one designated night,
they believe their entire slate is magically wiped clean.
Exactly.
It's a spiritual loophole.
Yeah.
And it actively encourages unethical behavior the rest of the year.
Right.
I mean, think about it. If I know I have a get-out-of-jail-free card waiting for me in the last week of Ramadan, the incentive to be a principled person in November, February just drops to zero.
It completely drops to zero.
Yeah.
But the linguistic breakdown in the sources completely dismantles this loophole.
How so?
Well, the root of the word Qadr does not mean magical night or forgiveness.
What does it mean?
The root actually means value, measure, or standard.
Oh.
Therefore, the Night of Decree is fundamentally supposed to symbolize living a life of value and principle.
Wow, so it's not about the night itself.
No. It is an intellectual recognition of the value of the ethical standards laid out in the Revelation.
Yeah.
It's not a spiritual jackpot you hit by staying up late.
That is a massive paradigm shift, and the historical timeline the sources provide adds such a fascinating layer to this.
It really does.
Because the Islamic calendar is lunar, which means it shifts by about 11 days every year relative to the solar calendar.
Right.
So a specific date in the lunar calendar rotates through all the seasons over a 33-year cycle. But the actual historical night that the first revelation occurred was obviously a fixed point in time.
It had to be. And the lectures provide a very specific historical anchor for this.
Yeah, what was it?
According to the Gregorian calendar, that first revelation likely occurred on a fixed date, March 11, 611.
March 11, 611, which raises a massive logical question. If the goal of the religion was simply to celebrate an anniversary, a historical event, you would logically use a solar calendar to pin down the exact day.
Right, you would treat it like a birthday.
Or a national holiday. I mean, we celebrate the 4th of July on the 4th of July, not on a rotating lunar schedule.
Exactly. So the lectures argue that the exact night is deliberately hidden within the shifting ambiguity of the lunar calendar for a really profound philosophical reason.
Which is?
It is hidden precisely to prevent the human psychological tendency to turn a single fixed date into a magical ritual.
Oh, wow. That makes so much sense.
Yeah, and there is a famous scriptural phrase that this night is better than 1,000 months.
Right.
The critique insists this is not a literal math equation where one night of prayer equals 83 years of reward.
Right, it's not a transaction.
It is a powerful metaphor. It means that living a life where even one single day is spent in absolute ethical clarity, acting on true principles and justice, is worth infinitely more than an entire average human lifespan.
Which is roughly 1,000 months.
Exactly.
Yeah.
1,000 months spent in ignorance, exploitation, and hollow repetition.
So it is an urgent command to make your entire life valuable rather than outsourcing your salvation to one night.
Precisely.
But, you know, outsourcing is just so much easier.
It really is.
Relying on magical beads and magical nights completely removes the burden of actually having to be a good person on a rainy Tuesday morning at the office when no one is looking.
Right. It's an abdication of personal responsibility.
Right.
And if an entire society abdicates personal responsibility, we run straight into the next major theme of these transcripts.
The trap of fatalism.
Exactly. If millions of people are relying on these magical rituals to save them, that points to a deeply ingrained sociological disease. And the lectures connect this directly to the concept of ajal.
Right. Ajal is a term that's almost universally translated in modern contexts as destiny. Specifically, it's viewed as an individual's pre-programmed, unalterable time of death.
So a death clock. Yeah. The traditional fatalistic view that has taken hold is that every single human being has an absolute expiration date stamped onto them by the divine before they are even born.
So if a person dies in a horrific car crash because the driver was drunk, or if someone is murdered in an alleyway, or if a poorly constructed apartment building collapses like a house of cards during a mild earthquake,
Right.
the default fatalistic response is, well, it was their ajal, it was their destiny, God wrote it, and we cannot question it.
And the thesis we're examining today argues that this is a complete catastrophic misinterpretation of the original text.
Catastrophic.
Yeah. The speaker forcefully argues that when the Quran utilizes the term ajal, it is almost exclusively referring to the lifespan and the inevitable expiration dates of civilizations.
Civilizations, not individuals.
Societies and empires.
Yeah.
Not an individual's biological death clock.
Wow.
It refers to the historical law of cause and effect, that civilizations rise based on justice and education, and they inevitably fall when they succumb to corruption and ignorance.
That is a huge distinction.
It is. By taking a macro concept meant to describe the sociological laws of history and shrinking it down to an inescapable individual death clock, you engineer a society paralyzed by fatalism.
And the real-world consequences of that ideological shift are genuinely terrifying.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, think about the apartment building example.
Yeah.
If a corrupt contractor bribes an inspector, uses cheap substandard concrete mixed with sea sand to build a residential block, and that building collapses in an earthquake, killing hundreds of people.
Right.
If the prevailing societal belief is that it was simply the victim's ajal, their pre-written destiny to die that day, then the contractor is entirely off the hook.
Exactly.
There is no public outrage, no demand for better building codes, no accountability. You can't hold a corrupt contractor responsible if society believes God was the one pulling the structural strings.
It's the perfect cover. Fatalism becomes the ultimate defense attorney for murderers, tyrants, and grossly negligent officials.
Wow.
If every event is pre-written in a cosmic ledger, then striving for justice, demanding safer infrastructure, or fighting political oppression is not only viewed as pointless.
It is culturally framed as a literal rebellion against the will of God.
Exactly. That is the paralyzing, chilling danger of what the speaker terms invented religion.
But, I want to push back on this framework for a second.
Sure.
Because the transcripts don't just stay in the realm of ancient theology. They bring in highly modern science to wrestle with this idea of destiny.
They do.
The lectures delve into genetics, sports biology, and even genetic predispositions to violence.
Yeah, there's a really interesting section there.
There's a specific mention of the FOXP2 speech gene that mutated hundreds of thousands of years ago, giving humans language capacity, and how athletes like Usain Bolt possess a specific variant of the ACTN3 sports gene that gives them an undeniable biological advantage in sprinting.
The speaker is clearly utilizing a multidisciplinary approach here, bridging ancient philosophical concepts of free will with contemporary biological determinism.
Right. But this is where the terrain gets incredibly tricky for anyone trying to maintain a philosophy of absolute free will.
How so?
Well, if modern science dictates that someone is born with a genetic predisposition to violence or addiction or, say, kleptomania,
right,
the transcripts actually recount a story about a man in prison who cynically joked that he stole his midwife's face the moment he was born because his compulsion to steal was so innately hardwired into him.
Right, I remember that.
Doesn't this biological reality sort of prove the fatalists right? If our neurochemistry and our DNA dictate our impulses, aren't we biologically programmed? Isn't our destiny literally written in our genetic code?
It's a great question. And the texts acknowledge these biological realities head on, but they introduce a razor-sharp, vital distinction to avoid falling into biological fatalism.
Okay, what's the distinction?
The argument rests on the mechanism of choice. A predisposition is not a destiny. The neurobiology might be real. Your amygdala might fire off an intense impulse toward aggression, or your dopamine receptors might make you highly susceptible to addiction.
Right.
But the transcripts argue that these genetic tendencies are starting points. They must be educated, managed, and controlled by the higher functions of the brain.
Wow. Okay.
The speaker even projects into the future, discussing CRISPR gene editing technology as a potential medical tool to eventually help manage severe, debilitating genetic predispositions.
Oh, wow. So treating a severe genetic behavioral leaning the same way we might eventually treat a genetic leaning toward heart disease.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the philosophical bedrock of the argument remains unchanged regardless of the technology.
Right.
Human free will, the concept of a raid, is defined here as the ultimate cognitive braking system.
The braking system.
Yeah. The impulse originates in your biology, but the conscious decision to physically act on that impulse is filtered through your prefrontal cortex, through your free will.
So you always have a choice.
Yes. The underlying thesis is that the very definition of being human, the singular characteristic that separates us from instinct-driven bacteria or animals, is the capacity to feel a biological impulse and consciously say no.
Wow.
Without that braking system, without taking ultimate responsibility for the final choice regardless of the initial impulse, we forfeit our humanity.
That's powerful.
Biology is the hand of cards you are dealt. I-raid is how you play them.
To scale this back up from the individual brain to an entire society, the lectures provide an incredibly poignant historical anecdote to ground this concept of rigorous responsibility.
Yes, the story about the German ambassador.
Right, Murat Hoffmann.
Hoffmann was a diplomat who lived through and witnessed the absolute catastrophic destruction of Germany during World War II.
Total destruction.
The speaker recounts a conversation where they asked Hoffmann how Germany managed to recover.
I mean, this was a nation completely reduced to ash.
Yeah.
A country where the strategic bombing was so intense that the asphalt in the streets of Dresden literally boiled at 1,000 degrees.
Just unimaginable devastation.
So how did a society that was completely annihilated physically, economically, and morally rebuild itself into a global powerhouse of philosophy, science, and industry in the span of just a few decades?
Well, the answer Hoffmann gave is the antithesis of the fatalistic mindset.
What does he say?
He didn't say, well, the rebuilding was our destiny, it was written. Nor did he say, we waited for a magical holy night to fix our infrastructure.
Right.
He cited two very painful active mechanisms. First, they learned from their catastrophic mistakes. And second, they engaged in relentless, rigorous self-criticism.
They looked at the ideology that destroyed them and dismantled it.
Exactly. And this historical example perfectly illustrates the speaker's interpretation of a foundational Quranic principle.
Which is?
The text highlights a verse stating explicitly that God does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves.
Wow.
It's presented as the ultimate anti-fatalism manifesto.
So if a society desires better conditions, a stronger economy, or a more just legal system, waiting for divine intervention or blaming a pre-written destiny is an exercise in delusion.
Absolute delusion. You have to look in the collective mirror, brutally critique your own societal failures, and undertake the grueling generational work of rebuilding.
And the German post-war recovery is used in these lectures to shame societies that sit in preventable squalor and blame destiny for the consequences of their own corruption and inaction.
Exactly.
But, if human choice, action, and accountability are so paramount to the architecture of this revealed religion, we inevitably run into a massive theological wall.
Right.
Because when you look at the foundational texts themselves, there are stories that seem to explicitly reward people for ignoring free will, acting on fatalistic precognition, and bypassing all ethical norms.
This is perhaps the most intellectually demanding and dangerous terrain covered in the transcripts.
Yeah, let's wrestle with this tension between literal interpretation and underlying wisdom.
Okay. The speaker dives deep into the famous, highly controversial narrative of Moses and the wise servant, a figure universally known in Islamic lore as Khidr.
And if you read this story plainly, as a literal sequence of events, it is absolutely wild.
It really is.
It reads like a horror story of divine injustice.
It is deeply disturbing on a literal level. The narrative structure follows Moses, who represents the pinnacle of formal law and earthly justice.
Mm-hmm.
And he's following this mysterious, wise servant to learn higher knowledge from him.
Right.
During their journey together, the wise servant commits 3 acts that violate every known ethical and legal standard.
Yeah, what does he do?
First, he deliberately damages a perfectly good ship belonging to poor fishermen who had generously offered them a ride.
Okay, property damage.
Then, he gratuitously rebuilds a wall in a hostile town that had cruelly refused them basic hospitality.
Weird, but fine.
And, most shockingly and problematically, he murders a young boy.
He just walks up and kills a child. And the justification provided within the narrative for this murder is that the boy would grow up to be evil and cause immense grief and rebellion for his righteous parents.
Right. Now, if a society reads this narrative literally as a historical event that actually took place,
which people do,
which they do, and as a viable legal or ethical precedent, the implications are catastrophic.
Oh, totally.
It establishes the precedent that extrajudicial murder, specifically the murder of innocents, is entirely acceptable, provided the perpetrator claims to possess some sort of secret divine precognition about the future.
It's the concept of pre-crime.
Yes.
It's the sci-fi movie Minority Report, where you arrest people before they commit the crime, but applied to ancient theology with lethal consequences.
Exactly.
How on earth does the speaker reconcile this story with the demand for an ethical, rational religion?
The reconciliation relies on introducing a critical philosophical and hermeneutical distinction between 2 specific terms.
Okay, what are they?
Gerseklik and hakikat.
Gerseklik and hakikat.
Yes. Gerseklik translates to reality, the literal, material, historical events that actually occur in time and space.
Okay.
Hakikat translates to truth, the underlying wisdom, the allegorical meaning, or the moral of a narrative.
Ah, I see where this is going.
The text insists forcefully that the story of Moses and the wise servant is entirely symbolic.
Symbolic, not reality.
Right. It belongs strictly to the realm of hakikat metaphor and truth, and has absolutely no place in the realm of Gerseklik literal reality.
So it never happened historically?
According to this view, no. It is an allegorical exploration designed to make the human mind wrestle with the paradoxes of life, the unseen consequences of our actions, and the severe limitations of human knowledge.
The speaker argues it is absolutely not a historical event to be emulated by human beings.
Definitely not.
But human history shows us exactly what happens when people inevitably ignore that philosophical distinction.
Sadly, yes.
The transcripts bring up a terrifying historical consequence of literalism. In the early centuries of Islamic history, there was a radical extremist sect known as the Kharijites, and they utilized a literal reading of this exact story, specifically the preemptive killing of the boy, to provide a theological justification for murdering the children of their political opponents.
It's horrific.
Yeah.
The historical record shows the Kharijites truly believed they were acting as modern-day wise servants.
I thought they were the good guys.
They convinced themselves they were executing divine will by preemptively slaughtering children they deemed would grow up to be enemies of their specific brand of faith.
Wow.
It is the ultimate warning regarding hermeneutics, the methodology of how we read and interpret texts.
It's like, imagine taking the novel Lord of the Flies.
Oh, the text actually mentions that book.
It does, as a brilliant example of a dark psychological metaphor exploring the inherent savagery in human nature. Imagine reading that book, and instead of understanding the metaphor, you use it as a literal instruction manual for how to run a kindergarten.
That would be a nightmare.
Right. You take a profound cautionary metaphor about the darkness of human nature, and you turn it into a literal administrative law. It leads to absolute disaster.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the speaker's warning. When the ignorant, or the deeply ideological, take a complex metaphor and strip it down to literal truth, the result is almost always bloodshed.
Yeah.
The underlying thesis here is that the Quran, and religious texts in general, are engineered to increase human cognitive capacity.
Not decrease it.
Right. They are designed to force the reader to think deeper, to wrestle with complex moral dilemmas, and to develop a robust ethical compass.
They are fundamentally not meant to provide a criminal defense manual for committing atrocities.
Exactly. Taking a metaphor and treating it as literal law is what the speaker calls the weaponization of metaphor.
The weaponization of metaphor. It's incredibly unsettling. I mean, we have beautiful metaphors being weaponized into justification for murder. We have active, intellectually demanding ethical commands being hollowed out into passive rituals like rolling beads.
Right.
We have the absolute necessity of societal responsibility being outsourced to a paralyzing fatalism.
It's a pattern.
When you stack all of this up, none of it feels like a mere accident of history.
It's not. And as the lectures move into examining the architecture of this invented religion, they make the bold claim that this literalism and this hollowing out of the ethical core isn't just accidental ignorance.
What is it, then?
It is a deliberately engineered political strategy.
A political strategy. Okay. The framework turns its critical eye toward the symbiotic relationship between invented religion and absolute political power.
Exactly. The argument is that the hollowing out of the ethical core is not a tragedy of misunderstanding. It is a feature.
A feature.
A feature deliberately cultivated and maintained by elites to exercise and maintain control over the masses.
But, you know, it's easy to say metaphor is weaponized in a vacuum, but the sources make a pretty bold claim that this is an engineered political strategy.
Right.
How exactly do you engineer a theological shift like that on a societal level? Like, how do you change the rules of the game?
You change the rules by fabricating new theological mandates that serve your political interests.
Give me an example from the text.
Well, the lectures highlight a massive, defining theological debate from early Islamic history regarding leadership.
Okay.
Specifically, the fabricated rule that imams, or the supreme leaders of the community, must exclusively come from the Quraysh tribe.
Which historically was the tribe of the prophet.
Yes.
So it's like the ultimate old boys club, but sanctified by a fabricated religious mandate to make it unquestionable.
Precisely. The speaker frames this rule as a blatant, engineered counter-revolution against the original text.
How so?
The Quran, according to the lectures, insists heavily and repeatedly on meritocracy. Leadership, whether of a nation or a local community, should be based entirely on competence, justice, intellectual capacity, and ethical standing.
Completely, regardless of a person's lineage or bloodline.
Exactly. But the architects of the invented religion countered this dangerous democratic idea by establishing a theological rule that only those with a specific genetic bloodline, the Quraysh, possessed the divine right to rule.
Wow.
The argument is that this was a deliberate, calculated reversion back to the tribalism of pre-Islamic Arabia, simply dressed up in new religious terminology.
It was an engineered method for a specific elite family to monopolize state power permanently, shutting out the rest of society regardless of their merit or capability.
Exactly. And to explore the stark contrast between how power should be utilized versus how it is historically utilized by these elites, the text dives into an intricate analysis of the figure of Dhul-Qarnayn.
Right, Dhul-Qarnayn, which translates literally to the two-horned one.
Yes, he's a prominent figure mentioned in the Quran as a remarkably powerful leader who traveled to the ends of the earth. For centuries, a vast number of traditional commentators and historians have eagerly equated him with the historical figure of Alexander the Great.
But the lectures vehemently tear down that historical association.
They absolutely demolish it.
They argue it is not just factually wrong, but morally corrosive.
Very corrosive. The textual analysis portrays Alexander the Great not as a righteous, divinely guided leader, but as a ruthless, megalomaniacal conqueror.
Right.
The speaker details the historical reality of Alexander's campaigns, how he marched his armies into Egypt, undertook a brutal trek deep into the western desert to the temple of the Oracle of Amun at Siwa.
And explicitly demanded to be recognized and worshipped as the literal son of a god.
Exactly. He left a trail of slaughter across continents and demanded absolute subservience from the populations he subjugated.
So the framework argues that Alexander represents the exact polar opposite of what the figure of Dhul-Qarnayn is meant to stand for.
Yes.
But, why does this historical distinction matter to the listener today?
It's a fair question.
I mean, whether an ancient, ambiguous figure was Alexander the Great or Cyrus the Great or someone else entirely, why does it matter to the overarching thesis of how religion is manipulated?
Because of the moral archetype it establishes in the subconscious of a civilization.
Okay, unpack that for me.
If your religious scholars teach the population that a ruthless, bloodthirsty conqueror who demanded to be worshipped as a living god is actually a holy, righteous figure endorsed by your sacred text,
you completely corrupt the moral compass of that society.
Exactly. You subtly teach the populace that raw power, no matter how cruelly or arrogantly it is exercised, is inherently holy. You legitimize tyranny.
Wow.
But the speaker argues that the narrative of Dhul-Qarnayn represents the ethical, constrained use of power.
Right. In the textual story, Dhul-Qarnayn doesn't conquer vulnerable people to enslave them.
No, he utilizes his vast resources to build a massive technological wall to protect an oppressed, technologically inferior people from tyranny.
And he doesn't demand worship or claim divinity.
Exactly. He explicitly attributes his strength and success to God.
So the argument is that the story of Dhul-Qarnayn is a timeless, archetypal message directed at anyone who holds power.
Anyone. Whether you are the emperor of a vast nation, the CEO of a modern corporation, or the head of a family.
The question is, will you utilize your power and resources to establish justice and protect the vulnerable? Or will you use it for oppression, extraction, and self-aggrandizement?
That is the core question.
And this exploration of tyranny brings us to the most intense, visceral critique found in the sources.
Yes, the Ottoman Empire.
Right. And as a quick reminder to you listening, we are just exploring the speaker's specific historical critique here. We aren't taking sides.
Mm-hmm.
But the lectures launch a severe, unsparing condemnation of the practices of the Ottoman Empire, specifically regarding the practice of fratricide.
The speaker pulls absolutely no punches when examining the historical reality of the Ottoman dynastic succession.
No, they don't.
The text specifically calls out Fatih Sultan Mehmet, universally revered as Mehmet the Conqueror, for taking the horrific step of legally codifying the practice of fratricide.
Right. This was the law stating that upon ascending to the throne, a new sultan had the legal and religious right, often framed as a duty to murder all of his male brothers.
And sometimes even their pregnant concubines.
Just awful. And the justification was theoretically to prevent future civil wars and secure the absolute stability of the state.
Right. And the raw numbers mentioned in the transcripts are just staggering and sickening.
They really are. It mentions a later sultan, Mehmed III.
Mm-hmm.
Upon taking power, he had 19 of his own brothers strangled with silk bowstrings in a single night.
In a single night?
And he subsequently had 19 of his own sons executed as well to protect his power. 19 brothers and 19 sons.
It's hard to even fathom.
And yet, the lectures note with absolute bitter irony that some of these rulers who engaged in or supported these practices, like Bayezid II, were bestowed the title Avilio,
meaning saint or friend of God, by the religious establishment.
That is just wild.
The speaker views this historical reality as the ultimate horrifying triumph of the invented religion. When a political leader can commit premeditated mass murder of his own family, when he can order infants slaughtered in their cribs to eliminate potential political rivals.
And the religious establishment not only looks the other way, but actively participates by declaring him a saint.
Right. Then the religion has been completely, structurally eviscerated of its ethical core.
Power itself has become the true deity being worshipped.
Exactly. The survival of the state apparatus, the devlet, is elevated to the level of the divine, used as the ultimate, unquestionable justification for any conceivable atrocity.
So the argument here is that when you declare a mass murderer a saint simply because he successfully holds the throne, you have crossed the Rubicon where religion is entirely replaced by a state-worshipping death cult.
That is exactly the argument.
It is incredibly heavy, and it really shatters the romanticized, sanitized versions of history we are often taught.
It does.
But the transcripts insist that these aren't just dry academic debates about ancient history.
Not at all.
They argue that the triumph of this invented religion has direct, observable consequences on the society we live in right now.
Absolutely.
Because when you strip away the ethics and worship power, the symptoms of that decay manifest everywhere in modern life. How does the speaker connect this to today?
Well, the analysis draws a direct, unbroken line from these ancient historical corruptions to contemporary social decay.
Okay.
If the dominant religious framework of a society is based on hollow rituals, paralyzing fatalism, and the unquestioning worship of state power, what kind of modern society does that architecture actually produce?
A pretty bleak one, I'd imagine.
The speaker lists several glaring modern symptoms. First, structural economic hypocrisy.
Right. The transcripts highlight the glaring absurdity of a modern state apparatus that loudly and piously bans online gambling sites in the name of protecting public morality, but simultaneously runs a massive multi-million-dollar national lottery system.
Yeah.
It is the perfect illusion of piety masking state-sponsored economic extraction from the poorest citizens.
It is. And it's a contradiction entirely enabled by a populace trained not to question authority.
Wow.
Another critical symptom explored is the rampant workplace exploitation carried out by supposedly pious individuals.
Right.
The lectures describe modern employers who meticulously observe every outward ritual.
They never miss a Friday prayer, they go on the Hajj pilgrimage, they fast.
Right, but they simultaneously exploit their workers, pay them starvation wages beneath the legal limit, and completely ignore vital safety standards in their factories.
Why do they feel they can do that?
Because their internalized version of invented religion has taught them that a few mechanical ritual prayers and rolling a bead automatically wipes away the sins of exploiting the vulnerable.
The beads strike again.
Exactly. They feel entirely psychologically justified in their greed.
You exploit a desperate worker, you steal their labor, and then you sit in the corner, roll the prayer beads, and believe your soul is perfectly clean.
The psychological dissonance is profound. Furthermore, the texts point to the horrific, ongoing justification of violence against women.
That's a huge point.
This is traced directly back to fabricated, deeply misogynistic texts and traditions that were deliberately smuggled into the religious canon centuries ago to serve and maintain patriarchal power structures.
Completely overriding the original egalitarian principles.
Yes. And finally, the symptom of blind, unthinking obedience to charismatic cult leaders.
And the lectures mention a truly heartbreaking, visceral story to illustrate the ultimate consequence of this blind obedience.
Yeah, the story of Farkhunda Maliksada in Afghanistan.
It's a tragic culmination of abandoned reason. Could you tell her story?
Farkhunda was a 27-year-old woman, a student of religious studies, who engaged in a theological argument with amulet sellers at a shrine in Kabul.
Right.
These were men peddling superstitious charms, paper amulets, the literal physical manifestations of invented religion.
Hollow rituals.
Exactly. She accused them of exploiting poor people. In retaliation, to protect their lucrative business, these men falsely shouted to the surrounding crowd that she had burned a Quran.
Oh, no.
A mob instantly formed, driven by blind, unthinking zealotry, manipulated effortlessly by those who use religion for profit and power. The mob brutally beat her to death in the streets, ran her over with a car, and set her body on fire.
That is just horrifying.
It is. The speaker invokes her tragic murder as the ultimate, horrifying symbol of what happens when a society discards reason, abandons critical ethics, and allows a mob to be weaponized by the purveyors of hollow religion.
It is a devastating reality check of what is at stake when critical thinking is classified as heresy.
It really is.
But, the transcripts do not leave us entirely in the dark.
Thankfully, no.
To counter this overwhelming decay, the speaker brings in a lineage of intellectual heroes, the thinkers, sociologists, and philosophers throughout history who recognized this corruption, who fought against the tide, and who desperately tried to clear the mud out of the river.
The lectures cite a monumentally important lineage of intellectual resistance.
Yeah.
They quote the great 20th century poet and philosopher Muhammad Iqbal.
Right.
He looked at the stagnant, oppressive state of the religious establishment of his time and famously declared to them, "Your religion is a factory that produces infidels."
Wow.
His profound point was that the corrupted, anti-intellectual, oppressive version of the faith actively drives thinking, ethical, moral people away from it.
That makes total sense. Who else did they mention?
The text also highlights Nurettin Topçu, an Anatolian philosopher who deeply lamented the total loss of genuine morality in the East, arguing that rituals had completely replaced the heart. It brings in the Iranian sociologist Ali Shariati, who explicitly warned against the Catholicization of Islam, meaning the transformation of a dynamic egalitarian movement into a rigid hierarchical institution controlled by a wealthy clergy.
Right.
And going back further, it champions the great 12th century Andalusian philosopher Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes.
Oh, I've heard of him.
Yeah, he wrote extensively championing the absolute necessity of harmonizing religious faith with rigorous Aristotelian reason and scientific inquiry.
So all of these figures fought to maintain an ethical, rational, and intellectually demanding approach to faith in the face of massive institutional opposition.
Exactly.
And the lectures highlight one final, incredibly powerful historical image to demonstrate what it actually looks like when these rational, democratic principles are put into practice at a societal level.
This is a great part of the text.
It involves the establishment of the first Turkish Grand National Assembly, the parliament, in 1920. Let's really picture this moment.
It is a stunning historical contrast.
Yeah.
When that first parliament was opened in Ankara, representing a monumental revolutionary shift from an absolute monarchy to a system of representation and popular sovereignty, the founders hung a plaque bearing a specific Quranic verse in the assembly hall.
What was the verse?
The verse they chose emphasized the concept of shura, which translates to mutual consultation, democratic decision-making, and the shared counsel of the community.
And the brilliant observation made in the transcripts is about the spatial architecture of power.
Yes.
They point out that this specific verse, a divine command insisting on consultation and shared power, was never hung in the grand opulent palaces of the emperors or the sultans for centuries.
Never. Because if you look at the architecture of a palace, it is designed around the throne room.
Right.
It is designed to physically enforce hierarchy, where one individual sits elevated above everyone else, issuing absolute decrees.
So true consultation, the act of taking the opinions and needs of the common people into account, is the mortal enemy of absolute dictatorial power.
Exactly. The palaces preferred the fabricated theological rules that consolidated unquestionable power into a single bloodline.
But the architecture of a parliament is entirely different.
It is often a semicircle designed for debate, pushback, and consensus.
So by choosing that specific verse about shura to hang over the parliament, the founders were explicitly reclaiming the original democratic and meritocratic ethos of the revealed religion,
wielding it against centuries of the authoritarian invented religion that had ruled from the palaces.
It is the perfect encapsulation of the entire struggle. We have covered an immense amount of historical and philosophical ground today, unpacking these complex transcripts.
We really have. If we synthesize the core thesis running through all of these sources, it boils down to this fundamental warning.
Which is?
When a philosophy or a religion is systematically stripped of its ethical core, when it loses its rigorous demand for social justice, and when it abandons its reliance on the human intellect, it inevitably transforms into a highly efficient, dangerous tool for oppression.
The vibrant, active pursuit of scientific knowledge and understanding the cosmos is reduced to the passive, hypnotic rolling of a prayer bead.
The complex sociological laws of cause and effect, the demand that societies build strong foundations, are replaced by a paralyzing fatalism that conveniently excuses both tyranny and gross incompetence.
And the strict original demand for meritocracy and justice is replaced by tribalism, the unthinking worship of empire, and the horrifying justification of atrocities like fratricide.
Ultimately, the framework we've analyzed today argues that the true historical battle is not between different religions, or even between religion and secularism.
What is it between?
The true battle is an internal one. It is between revealed religion, which demands that you be an active, ethical, deeply thinking human being, and invented religion, which simply demands your blind obedience, your passivity, and your money.
Which brings us right back to that muddy river we talked about at the very beginning. You've heard how a text and a philosophy originally meant to spark a massive intellectual and ethical awakening was slowly, over centuries, wrapped in suffocating layers of unquestioned ritual and political justification until the original message was almost entirely obscured.
Completely obscured.
And exploring this history forces a mirror onto our own lives and makes you wonder about the ethical systems, the corporate cultures, or even the personal daily philosophies we live by right now. How many of our own daily practices, the things we do on autopilot simply because that's how it's always been done, are actually hollow rituals that secretly contradict the very values we loudly claim to uphold? Are we living the truth, doing the relentless, difficult work of being ethical, responsible, and present in our societies? Or are we just sitting in a comfortable chair counting the beads?
Today's material is a transcript of a passionate, intellectually dense lecture series, exploring the symbolic and ethical dimensions of the Quran while fiercely critiquing dogmatic interpretations. Let's dive right into the feedback, starting with how the material's ambitious scope frequently causes the narrative to jump abruptly between ancient scriptural analysis and modern sociopolitical grievances, which disrupts the logical flow.
Yeah, that is exactly where the friction lies in this draft, right? Because when we actually dive into the text, we're presented with some genuinely, highly sophisticated theological analysis.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, there is this brilliant section unpacking the symbolic meaning of Musa and the wise servant in Surah Kahf. It goes deep into the paradoxes of justice.
The whole idea of damaging a ship to ultimately save it, right?
Right, exactly. It tackles these profound complexities of human epistemology and the inherent limits of what we can understand about divine will. It's a masterful, deeply engrossing philosophical breakdown.
It really is.
But then, almost mid-breath, the narrative suddenly pivots into discussions about modern criminal genetics.
Yeah, I felt that exact whiplash. You know, you're completely immersed in this ancient scriptural allegory, and then in the very next paragraph, you're just hit with the FOXP2 speech gene.
Yeah, 200,000 years of human biological mutation out of nowhere.
Right. And then suddenly we're dissecting the historical fratricides committed by Ottoman sultans. It's just so jarring.
It really is. And, well, it's important to note that these are genuinely fascinating and relevant connections, you know? Like for an expert audience, tying ancient epistemology to modern genetics or historical power dynamics is thrilling.
Sure, it shows a huge breadth of knowledge.
Exactly. But the abruptness of these transitions makes the overarching argument feel scattered. I mean, think about what is happening in the reader's brain here.
They're just scrambling to keep up?
Right. When you force your audience to constantly recalibrate their mental framework, shifting from ancient allegory to modern biology, then back to medieval politics, you are entirely draining their cognitive resources.
Because they have to constantly load a new context window just to follow the sentence.
Precisely. The brain has to, stop processing the profound philosophical point about the limits of human knowledge just to figure out what century or scientific discipline we're currently standing in.
Yeah, which ends up completely diluting the impact of that primary thesis.
Exactly.
So a key theme running through this material seems to be this intense, almost frantic desire to connect the ancient text to every single facet of modern reality. It kind of reminds me of a rather over-enthusiastic museum tour.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, like right now, the guide is running back and forth between the ancient artifacts wing and the modern art wing without warning the guests. They're just sprinting down the halls shouting, look at this Bronze Age sword, and now look at this abstract painting.
That is a perfect visualization of the reading experience, honestly.
But I do have to push back slightly here.
Oh.
Well, I can see what you're going for with smoothing this out. But if we strictly separate the historical and the modern examples, do we risk robbing the piece of its passionate stream of consciousness energy?
You think it would lose its edge?
Because honestly, that relentless cascading energy is a huge part of its appeal. It feels really urgent.
That's a fascinating point, actually, and a totally valid concern. We certainly do not want to sterilize the author's voice. I mean, passion is a lot like water, right?
Right.
If it flows down a directed, structured channel, it generates massive power, like a hydroelectric dam. But if it just floods everywhere in all directions without boundaries, well, it creates a swamp.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, the passion doesn't disappear when you give it structure. It simply becomes more effective. We just need the author to establish clear thematic bridges, by employing a structural framework that deliberately signals to the audience when the lecture is moving from scriptural exegesis to contemporary application.
Okay, yeah, I love that distinction. So we aren't telling the author to cut their modern insights or kill their passion. We're just asking them to build a bridge over the swamp.
Exactly that.
Let's brainstorm how they might actually do that on the page then. I think the simplest fix is just installing a turn signal for the reader's brain. Introduce an explicit transitional phrase before making that massive cognitive leap.
Like a specific pivot sentence?
Exactly. So instead of just dropping the Ottoman Empire into a paragraph about Musa, the author could write something like, "To understand how this ancient symbol of power applies to our reality, let's look at historical dynamics like those in the Ottoman court."
Oh, I see.
It takes 10 words, but it gives the reader a split second to brace for the jump.
That works beautifully. It's subtle but highly effective. Another angle to consider is structural modularity.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if the sentence-by-sentence whiplash is the core issue, what if they just quarantined all the modern socio-political grievances into a dedicated contemporary applications module?
Oh, so instead of weaving the genetics and the Ottoman history into the theology as they go, they finish the theological thought completely.
Exactly. You fully resolve the deep discussion on Musa and the wise servant. You synthesize the core ancient lesson for the reader, let them sit with it, and then introduce a new section that explicitly says, now, how does this ancient paradox manifest in our modern world?
Right. It preserves every ounce of the author's passion, but it sequences the information in a way the human brain can actually digest.
It gives the reader a moment to breathe.
Yeah, definitely. And if the author really wants to keep weaving them together, there is a third option. They could lean into their own recurring motifs.
Oh, like what?
So throughout the text, the author uses this concept of Uydurulan, which translates to the made-up religion, right? Or the corrupted, dogmatic version of faith.
Yes, they bring that up a lot.
They could use that exact phrase as an explicit structural anchor.
Tell me more about how that would actually function in the text.
It would act like a refrain in a song. The author ventures out into some complex genetic theory or political history, but at the end of that tangent, they intentionally return to the phrase Uydurulmuş to cleanly tie the modern example back to the ancient text.
Oh, I like that. It grounds the listener.
Exactly. Every time things start to feel chaotic, the refrain kicks in, bringing us back to the core thesis.
That is brilliant. It creates an intellectual rhythm. You preserve the wild, exploratory energy you loved, but you give it a sturdy skeleton to stand on.
Yeah, absolutely. So if that structural rhythm is the key to keeping the audience intellectually engaged, we still have to figure out how to keep them emotionally engaged. Because right now, the persistent use of adversarial and highly charged rhetoric risks alienating the specific demographic that would benefit most from this intellectual awakening.
Yeah, this is perhaps the most critical hurdle the material faces. I mean, we can fix the structure all day, but if the delivery pushes people away, the structural bridges won't matter at all.
No, they won't.
The text frequently relies on aggressive, almost combative phrasing. It constantly hammers that concept of Uydurulan we just talked about, but it does so in a way that calls out the ignorance of traditionalists and directly challenges the audience's perceived blind faith.
Right. The material makes a strong, deeply philosophical case for an intellectual approach to religion, but then it resorts to mocking everyday believers.
Yes, exactly.
It ridicules their reliance on those Gulu Yasin booklets. It mocks the literalist reading of Hadith. It portrays people who follow these cultural traditions as almost willfully ignorant or hypocritical.
And we have to ask, what happens psychologically when a reader encounters that? Because the author is trying to reach people who are steeped in these traditions, right?
Right, that's the target audience.
So if someone holds those practices dear, perhaps because it connects them to their grandparents or because it's the only way they've ever known how to express their devotion, this tone triggers immediate defensiveness.
Their shields go up instantly.
Literally. Their amygdala lights up, cortisol floods their system, and they literally stop processing logical information.
Oh, wow, yeah.
The author has these profound, beautiful arguments about reason, ethics, and the true meaning of Surah al-Qadr as a measure of spiritual value rather than some mystical lottery ticket. But the reader never hears it.
Because they're too angry.
Exactly. The philosophy becomes completely overshadowed because the reader is too busy defending their core identity from what feels like a personal attack.
I hear you, but let's look closely at the intention behind that section. The author's fiery, prophetic tone is clearly a deliberate stylistic choice, isn't it?
Oh, definitely deliberate.
It feels akin to a modern-day reformer standing in the town square trying to shatter the status quo. So my question is, at what point does softening the tone dilute the necessary shock value required to wake people from what the author views as a dogmatic slumber?
That's a fair question.
Because there is a nuanced balance here between holding the reader's hand and, grabbing them by the shoulders to shake them awake. Sometimes a jolt is required to break through centuries of cultural conditioning.
That is a very robust defense of the author's stylistic choice, and the passion is authentic. But let's look at the mechanics of persuasion here.
Okay, let's hear it.
There's a vast difference between shaking someone awake and punching them in the face while they sleep.
Yeah, that's true.
If you shake them, they might be startled, but they will wake up and look around. If you punch them, they wake up swinging at you.
Right, they're just fighting back.
The goal of this material isn't just for the author to be right on the page. It's to be transformative for the reader. If the audience puts the text down in anger on page 10, the transformation fails.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So the author needs to recalibrate the tone by shifting the rhetorical stance from an adversarial attack on false traditions to a collaborative, empathetic invitation to rediscover forgotten truths.
I can see the power in that shift. It moves the author from being an opponent across the boxing ring to being a guide sitting next to the reader.
Exactly.
Let's think about how to actually execute this rhetorical shift on the page. I think the easiest way is reframing the blame.
How so? What would that look like?
So instead of saying something direct and accusatory like, you replaced the true religion with a made-up one, the author could pivot the lens to history. They could write, historically, we can observe how beautiful original principles were gradually obscured by cultural habits.
Oh, do you see the difference there?
Yeah, it removes the personal accusation entirely. It blames the passage of time in history rather than blaming the reader sitting on their couch reading the book.
That is excellent. It allows the reader to agree with the critique without feeling indicted by it. Building on that empathetic approach, I think gently utilizing the Socratic method could work wonders here.
How would you apply that?
Well, take the section where the author outright mocks the cultural practice of wrapping the Quran in an ornate cover and hanging it high up on a wall. The author clearly despises this because it treats the text as an untouchable relic rather than a practical guide.
Right, they see it as the ultimate symbol of abandoning the intellect.
Exactly. But instead of mocking it, what if the text validated the original intention and then asked a question? We hang the book high on our walls out of profound respect. But how might we reconcile this practice of physically elevating the book with the text's deep, urgent emphasis on bringing its intellect down into our daily lives?
Wow, that is masterful. Because you are telling the reader, I know you did this out of love.
Right, you're validating them first.
But then you challenge the execution of that love. It forces the reader to reach the critical conclusion themselves, rather than having it shoved down their throat.
Exactly.
And to make that even smoother, the author could amplify the use of inclusive pronouns.
Ah, the royal we.
Yes. So instead of accusatory phrasing like, you are blindly following these superstitions, pivot to, we must be careful not to let our comfort and tradition blind us to the demanding intellectual rigor of the text.
That's so much better.
Using we puts the author in the exact same boat as the reader. It says, we are all susceptible to this human flaw. Let's figure out how to fix it together.
It completely lowers the shields. And once those emotional shields are down, the reader is finally receptive to those massive, paradigm-shifting theological arguments the author so desperately wants to share.
Exactly. And speaking of those theological arguments, once the reader's defenses are down and they're comfortably following the structural flow, we have to look at what they are actually spending their time reading.
Right, the actual content of the chapters.
Because the exploration of deeply symbolic narratives often gets bogged down in dismantling absurd historical myths, which distracts from the affirmative philosophical lessons.
This is a matter of textual real estate. And right now, the allocation is completely skewed.
It really is.
The weakness here is that when the material discusses monumental scriptural figures like Dhul-Qarnayn or the wise servant, it spends an inordinate amount of time actively refuting literalist interpretations.
Yes, the author gets completely sidetracked. Like, as I understand it from the text, there are long, exhaustive debates about whether Dhul-Qarnayn was historically Alexander the Great.
Oh, it goes on forever.
The text goes deep into Alexander's military conquests, his trip to the Apis temple in Egypt, his specific behavior during the siege of Gaza. It just goes on and on.
And then later, it pivots to dissecting whether Khidr was an extraterrestrial alien.
Wait, really?
Yes. Or debating the literal legal morality of Khidr killing a child in the narrative. It is exhausting.
I can imagine.
By the time the author finishes proving that Dhul-Qarnayn couldn't possibly be Alexander the Great because Alexander demanded people worship him as a god, well, the reader's cognitive battery is dead.
They've lost the plot entirely.
Right. This exhaustive myth-busting consumes incredibly valuable space. That space should be devoted to the core affirmative lesson, the profound ethics of power, the absolute necessity of justice over brute strength, and the psychological archetypes these ancient figures represent in the human mind.
It reminds me of a sculptor who has been commissioned to carve a magnificent marble statue.
Okay, I like where this is going.
But instead of letting us admire the finished piece, the sculptor spends hours and hours talking about the wooden scaffolding they had to build to reach the top of the marble, and how terrible the scaffolding was, and how hard it was to tear the scaffolding down.
That is exactly what reading those chapters feels like.
Right? You have to tear down the scaffolding eventually to see the art. But how do we balance the necessity of clearing away these deeply entrenched cultural myths with the need to build a positive, forward-looking theological framework?
Well, you do have to clear the myths, but you don't need to hand the audience every splinter of wood to prove you tore the scaffolding down.
That's a great way to put it.
You can just brush it aside. The author needs to streamline the myth-busting process by acknowledging the traditional misconceptions briefly and then immediately pivoting to the profound affirmative takeaway. Don't fight the myth on its own terms, transcend it entirely.
Let's give the listeners some ways to put this into practice. How do you transcend the myth without getting dragged into an historical debate?
I highly recommend a strict, not X, but Y formula.
Okay, let's role-play this. How would a typical, exhaustive refutation sound?
It would sound something like, Dhul-Qarnayn cannot be Alexander the Great because Alexander conquered Gaza in 332 BC and declared himself the son of Amun, whereas the Quranic figure is a monotheist who submits to divine will. Therefore, all the historians who link them are completely wrong.
Right. It's defensively postured and drags us into 332 BC.
Exactly.
Instead, let's apply not X, but Y. The author writes, the text isn't a historical account to be cross-referenced with Alexander the Great. Rather, it is a timeless mirror reflecting the responsibilities of power.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly efficient.
Right? You acknowledge that the Alexander theory exists, you dismiss it as missing the entire point of the text in half a sentence, and you immediately replace it with the affirmative philosophical truth.
Exactly. It reclaims the narrative high ground instantly. Now, what about the truly absurd myths, like the theories about Qadr being an alien or some immortal wandering the earth?
I think you have to quarantine those.
Quarantine them?
Yeah. Dedicate a single, brief, contained paragraph to listing all the literalist myths together as a cautionary tale of missing the point. You frame it by saying, when we lose our connection to symbolic language, we end up debating whether these figures were Macedonian kings or extraterrestrials.
Oh, that's good.
That completely neuters the myths by categorizing them as absurdities. Then you spend the rest of the section purely unpacking the symbolic meaning of the two horns or the iron wall.
It is a phenomenal way to clean house. But what if the author feels absolutely compelled to include the historical evidence proving Dhul-Qarnayn isn't Alexander? What if they fear academics will accuse them of not doing their homework?
Put it in a footnote.
Ah, yes.
Or an appendix at the back of the book. Just remove the debates about specific historical kings from the main text entirely. Keep the main body of the text focused purely on the epistemology of power.
Right. Let the footnotes do the heavy lifting for the academics.
Exactly. The footnote satisfies the historians, but it keeps the narrative momentum soaring for the general reader.
We want the reader walking away thinking deeply about their own ethical responsibilities in the modern world, not about Macedonian military supply routes.
That is the ultimate goal, right there, keeping the reader focused on the transformative power of the ideas.
To recap, we discussed establishing clear thematic bridges to smoothly transition between ancient allegorical texts and modern socio-political applications, ensuring the reader doesn't suffer cognitive whiplash.
Yeah, those bridges are essential.
We also talked about softening the adversarial tone, moving from a combative stance to an empathetic invitation, so the audience actually lowers their defenses and absorbs the profound insights.
Dropping those shields?
And finally, we discussed streamlining the myth-busting process, moving the heavy historical debunking out of the way to keep the spotlight firmly on the affirmative philosophical lessons regarding power, ethics, and human limits.
Yeah, implementing these actionable suggestions will ensure the material's profound insights resonate deeply with its intended audience. It moves the text from just preaching to the choir to genuinely reaching those who need to hear it most.
We highly encourage the submission of the next draft of this material for another critique in the future. We would really love to see how this evolves.
Definitely.
Ultimately, we want to make sure that while the edges of that ancient tapestry might still be smoking with the author's undeniable passion, the flames are controlled enough that the audience can finally step close, feel the warmth, and marvel at the masterpiece woven into the center.
Welcome to the debate. Today we are unpacking a really fascinating piece of source material. It explores the deep friction between, revealed symbolic meaning and fabricated literalism.
Right, and it weaves together theology, history, science, pretty much everything.
Exactly. It asks a really fundamental question. What is the ultimate driver of human behavior and morality? Like if an individual possesses a specific genetic mutation, what some might call a murder gene, are they truly responsible for their actions? Or are they just sort of a passenger in a biological vehicle hurtling toward a predetermined crash?
Yeah, it's a text that really doesn't let anyone off the hook easily. I mean, it approaches the human condition with a very cold, clinical lens.
And I think that's exactly where our division lies today. I'm going to be arguing that this text is ultimately a manifesto for absolute ethical liberation. It demands that we use our free will to transcend literalism and actively calibrate our moral compass.
Well, I will be arguing the contrasting position. I believe the material actually reveals a deep, inescapable biological and physical determinism. It shows that our so-called free will is heavily constrained by structural realities, from genetics all the way down to the laws of entropy.
Okay, so let's start with the foundation of my position. When I read this text, the core thesis screams that human intellectual capacity and moral choice are supreme. I mean, the author actually uses a brilliant modern metaphor.
The computer one, right?
Yeah, exactly. They compare human consciousness to a computer, suggesting that the ultimate goal of our existence is to increase our mental capacity. It's essentially like adding more RAM to the motherboard.
Adding RAM is a great metaphor, but, we have to remember what that implies. You can add all the memory you want, but you are still entirely bound by the physical reality of the hardware.
Well, sure, but...
I mean, the silicon, the wiring, the physics of heat dissipation, that underlying architecture dictates exactly what the machine can and cannot do.
True, but the text argues that this capacity is expanded through intentional intellectual struggle. Like, it demands that we actively reject what it calls fabricated religion.
And by fabricated religion, the text means systems that require zero cognitive effort, right?
Exactly. It describes these systems as offering effortless rewards. For instance, treating the theological concept of Qadr night, the night of power, as some sort of cosmic lottery ticket that just magically washes away a lifetime of sins without any behavioral change.
Right. It's too easy.
Right. Or the mindless rote spinning of 108 Buddhist beads or 33 Hindu beads. The text argues that by rejecting these lazy, fabricated shortcuts, humans are forced into genuine responsibility. I mean, it fiercely condemns literalism, calling it a crime against the text.
Yeah, it uses very strong language there.
It really does. And this points directly to human agency and ethical calibration, a process the text refers to as calibration. The whole point is that we are meant to interpret, to push boundaries, and to actively choose our moral framework.
You're painting a very triumphant, optimistic picture of human agency. But I look at the same text and see a completely different underlying reality. While it certainly pays lip service to moral responsibility, it constantly tethers our behavior to physical and biological realities that we have absolutely no control over.
How so? Like, where do you see that hard determinism?
Well, it's right there in the biology. The material explicitly points to the FOXP2 gene. It notes that it took a 200,000-year mutation for humanity to even develop the physical capacity for complex speech.
Wow, right.
So our variability to have this intellectual debate right now isn't some triumph of free will. It's the result of blind biological luck. And it also points to the sports gene that dictates the physical limits of an athlete like Usain Bolt.
Sure, physics matter, but
then it goes much darker. It delves into criminology, discussing a murder gene found in serial killers.
But acknowledging biology doesn't automatically erase free will.
It severely limits it. I mean, when you synthesize these examples, the text is positing that free will is not some magical generative power that initiates action. Instead, free will is merely a brake pedal on our biological impulses.
A brake pedal? Okay.
Yeah. Therefore, human morality isn't a conquest. It is a constant, exhausting struggle against predetermined cosmic and biological entropy. We don't start the engine. We're just desperately trying not to crash.
Okay, I think we need to test that deterministic reading against how the material handles textual interpretation and violence. Let's look at the narrative of Musa, Moses, and the wise servant, often referred to as Khidr.
Oh, right. That's arguably the most difficult and controversial part of the text.
Which is why it's so important. In this story, the wise servant commits acts of sheer, incomprehensible violence, including the killing of a young boy, under the justification that the child is destined to grow up and commit horrific evil.
Yeah, it's a brutal story.
It is. But the text explicitly uses this narrative to demonstrate the absolute danger of reading symbolic stories as literal instructions.
Because when humans take it literally, they try to replicate it in the real world.
Precisely. The text points to the historical example of the Kharijites. This was an extremist sect who read narratives like this literally and used them as a theological license to murder innocents. They genuinely believed they were acting with the same divine foresight as the wise servant.
Which is terrifying, obviously.
Right. The material insists we must separate reality, the external historical facts, from truth, which is the internal symbolic wisdom. The story is a symbolic framework designed to provoke intellectual growth. Taking it as a blueprint for human action is a catastrophic failure of that calibration we talked about.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You're framing this as a purely symbolic cautionary tale, but honestly, it bypasses a much darker theme running right through the center of the text, which is the concept of creative destruction.
Explain what you mean by that. How does creative destruction tie into the violence of the wise servant?
Well, the text goes to great lengths to establish that creative destruction isn't a metaphor. It is the fundamental operating system of the universe. It points out that our own bodies are in a constant state of violent turnover. The cells in our faces and our stomach linings completely die off and are replaced every 6 months.
Right, cellular regeneration.
But the text emphasizes the death part of that regeneration. If those old cells don't die, what happens? We get cancer. Stagnation is fatal. Then the text zooms out to the macroscopic world. A lion viciously hunting and killing a gazelle isn't an act of cruelty. It is a necessary, predetermined mechanism of balance that keeps the entire ecosystem from collapsing.
Okay, wait, pause for a second. Let me make sure I'm following your logic here. When you say our bodies undergo creative destruction constantly, and tie that to the violence in the Musa story, how exactly is the text connecting cellular decay to human moral choices?
By showing that the violence of the wise servant isn't just a symbol for intellectual growth. It reflects a terrifyingly deterministic universe where brutal, incomprehensible forces operate far beyond the boundaries of human ethical frameworks.
So the violence is structural?
Yes. The universe requires destruction to function. The violence in the story is a reflection of the structural reality of the cosmos. To dismiss it as just a symbol ignores the physical laws the text is forcing us to confront.
But taking the wise servant's actions literally, or, as a reflection of how we should operate in reality, is like eating a paper menu instead of the meal it describes. The story is a map pointing you toward internal wisdom. It is not the terrain you are supposed to walk on.
But the terrain itself is violent.
Yes, but the human mandate is to rise above it. The text actually provides a brilliant analogy to combat this exact kind of fatalistic literalism. It's the story of the salt cellar. A salt seller, motivated entirely by human greed and a desire to boost his profits, fabricated a religious rule stating that people must eat salt before beginning a meal.
Oh, I remember this.
Right? And over time, people forgot the origin of the rule and began treating this pure fabrication as divine law.
So you're saying literalism is a human fabrication?
Exactly. The text is warning us that taking the wise servant's incomprehensible cosmic actions as a literal instruction manual for human justice is exactly like falling for the salt seller's trick. It is a human fabrication that abuses a cosmic reality. In the human realm, the text explicitly demands that our justice system be based on equality and non-maleficence.
Non-maleficence meaning?
Doing no harm. It specifically cites the foundational medical principle primum non nocere. First, do no harm. We are strictly forbidden from acting like the wise servant. This proves the text believes we have the free will and the ethical mandate to construct a moral reality completely distinct from the brutal laws of nature.
That distinction sounds very neat and tidy, but the text itself blurs the line between the brutal laws of nature and human morality when it dives into criminology. Let's look at the kleptomania example.
You mean the prisoner who joked about the midwife's face?
Yes, exactly. The material relates an anecdote about a prisoner who joked that he was born stealing the midwife's face. He literally could not stop his compulsion to steal. And this isn't just a metaphor.
Right, it's physiological.
Completely physiological. The text explicitly addresses the existence of a murder gene in certain serial killers, stating that some individuals possess neurological impulses they simply cannot suppress on their own.
But the text doesn't say they are completely absolved of all responsibility.
No, but it severely undercuts your vision of pure, liberating moral choice. I mean, if a person's physical, neurological wiring dictates that they have an overwhelming compulsion to steal or kill, where exactly is the ethical liberation? What is the mechanism for free will if the hardware is corrupted?
Well, that's where the RAM upgrade comes in.
But listen to the text's ultimate solution for this. It posits that for these incurable, deep-seated genetic predispositions, future CRISPR gene editing technology will be necessary to stop the behavior.
Wait, CRISPR?
Yes. It specifically mentions genetic editing. Think about the implications of that mechanism. If human morality, stopping someone from committing murder, requires surgical genetic editing at the molecular level, then biology fundamentally dictates behavior. We aren't saving a soul, we are just editing code. Pure free will is an illusion, layered over a biological script.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective based on the specific vocabulary the text uses. It makes a crucial, definitive distinction here. It firmly asserts that genetic fate does not exist. It insists we call them genetic predispositions.
That sounds like a semantic dodge.
It's not, though, because of the mechanism the text introduces next. It claims that predispositions can be educated. Yes, biology provides the starting line, but it absolutely does not dictate the finish line. The material explicitly argues that claiming my genes made me do it is an invalid excuse used by humans to dodge personal responsibility.
But how do you educate a biological impulse without just suppressing it?
Think about a muscle. The physical capacity of a muscle is only increased when it is forced to lift a heavy weight against the resistance of gravity, right? Human moral capacity works the exact same way. It is forged precisely by pushing against these biological predispositions.
So it's resistance training.
Exactly. The text views these biological constraints, even the severe ones, not as an iron cage,
but as the necessary resistance training for the education of the will. The hurdle doesn't negate the reality of the race.
Okay, but let's look at the actual mechanism of that so-called will, because the text uses the butterfly effect to explain how human consciousness actually operates.
The chaos theory concept?
Yes. A mathematician and meteorologist tracking a devastating hurricane in the Americas traces its absolute origin back to the flap of a butterfly's wings on the coast of Africa, where the green meets the desert, the Savai Hill.
Right, a tiny, imperceptible movement cascades into an unstoppable force.
Exactly. And the text explicitly applies this meteorological determinism to human thought.
So you're saying our thoughts are like the weather?
The text is saying that. It states that our ideas, our impulses, our darkest desires rise from the bottom up. They bubble up from our biology, our genetics, and our subconscious exactly like a weather system forming over the ocean. Free will does not flap the butterfly's wings. You do not choose your impulses.
But you choose whether to act on them.
Exactly. Which proves my point. The text argues that the only place free will exists is in the capacity to not act, to apply the brakes. We aren't driving the car. We are just passengers in a biological vehicle hurtling down a mountain, desperately trying to pump the brakes. Therefore, our ethics are constantly at the mercy of biological hurricanes that we did not initiate.
But if we were merely passengers, just pumping the brakes, we couldn't build highly complex, enduring civilizations of justice. But the text explicitly shows that this is possible through the historical example of Dhul-Qarnayn.
Dhul-Qarnayn is an interesting case study, but he's an exception, not the rule.
He is the model of what human agency can achieve, though. The material brings up Dhul-Qarnayn to prove that human agency can systematically conquer environmental and structural challenges. And it does this by contrasting him with the historical Alexander the Great.
Right. Alexander represents the unchecked impulses we were just talking about.
Exactly. Alexander the Great allowed his ultimate power to corrupt him entirely. He succumbed completely to his biological and psychological impulses. He marched to Egypt, claimed to be the son of the sun god Ra, demanded to be worshipped as a deity, murdered his own respected commander simply for refusing to bow to him, and, took sex slaves. He is the hurricane of unchecked impulse.
No argument there. That's a perfect example of the storm taking over.
Right. But then look at Dhul-Qarnayn. He possessed immense power, but he represents the conscious, willed choice to construct justice. He didn't just pump the brakes on his own desires. He engineered a massive, systemic defense of the vulnerable, building an iron and copper barrier between the oppressor and the oppressed.
A literal wall.
Yes. He looked at the brutal state of nature and said, no, we are going to build a structure of ethics here. This proves the text ultimately believes in the triumph of constructed human agency over our baser instincts.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the underlying physics of what happens to that wall over time? You're highlighting the construction but ignoring the decay. The text explicitly invokes the second law of thermodynamics, entropy.
Entropy being the gradual decline into disorder.
Right. The fundamental physical law of the cosmos is that every closed system slides from order to disorder. Heat dissipates, iron rusts, walls crumble. And here is where it gets brilliant. The material applies this physical law directly to human sociology.
How does sociology mimic thermodynamics, though?
Because maintaining order, maintaining true morality, requires massive amounts of energy. Cognitive energy, emotional energy, structural energy. Humans, like all matter, naturally and inevitably gravitate toward the lowest possible energy state.
And what is the lowest energy state for human morality?
Fabricated religion. That's exactly why people invent those effortless lotteries for paradise, or spin 108 beads, or rely on an intercessor who will automatically save them without demanding any personal change.
I see.
These fabrications require zero intellectual risk and zero behavioral effort. They are the sociological equivalent of a system collapsing into its lowest energy state.
But the fact that the text condemns this means we are supposed to fight it.
We can fight it, but look at the scale of the fight. When Dhul-Qarnayn builds the wall of justice, the text recognizes this as a temporary, highly localized, and incredibly exhausting fight against the universe's fundamental law of decay. The text's invocation of entropy proves that your utopian view of sustainable, absolute ethical liberation is scientifically and sociologically impossible in the long run. We aren't transcending the cosmos, we are fighting a losing battle against its fundamental laws.
Well, a difficult battle against entropy is not the same as a losing battle. And that distinction is everything. To summarize my position in light of our discussion, I fully acknowledge that the material presents intense biological, physical, and historical challenges. It doesn't shy away from the brutality of nature, the reality of cellular destruction, or the heavy weight of our genetic predispositions. However, its core message remains a profound rallying cry for intellectual calibration and ethical responsibility.
Even against the immense forces of thermodynamics.
Especially against them. The fact that the text explicitly demands we read the book of nature critically, that we reject the effortless entropic slide into fabricated rituals, and that we actively educate our predispositions like lifting weights against gravity, proves that meaning and justice are the ultimate human pursuits. The capacity to choose, to build the wall, to reject literalism, even if it requires immense energy, is the defining feature of our humanity.
And to summarize my perspective, I think we have to accept that the text is undeniably grounded in a stark, unyielding realism. By acknowledging the reality of the murder gene, the very real potential necessity of CRISPR gene editing for behavioral control, and the inescapable cosmic law of entropy, the material demonstrates that our agency is profoundly, structurally limited.
You really see us as fundamentally constrained then?
I see us as part of the physical universe, not separate from it. While we can occasionally apply the brakes of free will to stop a specific impulse that bubbles up from our subconscious, our overall trajectory is heavily governed by the physical and biological realities of the cosmos. Our moral victories, like Dhul-Qarnayn's wall, are localized, temporary anomalies in a universe defined by creative destruction and decay.
If you are listening to this and wondering where you fit into this grand cosmic architecture, that is exactly the intellectual struggle the text demands of us. We've explored a deeply layered piece of material today, one that masterfully weaves together theology, biology, and physics.
It certainly doesn't offer easy answers. It forces us to look in the mirror and ask deeply uncomfortable questions about the mechanics of our own choices.
And it leaves unresolved that razor-thin boundary between our predetermined genetic blueprints and our ultimate moral responsibilities. So we leave it to you, the listener, to continue exploring these intricate layers within the material yourself. Going back to where we started, are you the architect upgrading the RAM of your own moral capacity? Or are you just a passenger, desperately trying to pump the brakes on a machine whose hardware you cannot change? Keep questioning.